All right. Thank you all for joining us for the third installment of Quest for Light. In this presentation, we're going to be exploring what I'm calling reHistory, which is basically going deep into our past in order to gain a new understanding and respect for these ancient cultures, as well as learning their true origins, or at least expanding our understanding of their origins. Max and I have been interested in this topic for quite some time. We both connected deeply over this topic about a year ago, and both independently have been researching this. It sort of became an obsession for me, and I think for Max too, because like I said earlier, when you start to explore the content that we're going to be talking about here, it radically changes your understanding of our history, and it gives you a new perspective of what is possible. We're going to explore the relationship that these ancient cultures had to technology, for example, and it really shines a light on how our perception has influenced our ability to create technology and sort of created it in one avenue, whereas other cultures, based on their perception and how they viewed their creative capacity, were able to use it in a very different way, create technology and culture in a very different way. And yeah, we're excited to be exploring that here. So yeah, the thesis is that we've come from we're a culture that has essentially forgotten where our origins are from. And our primary method of determining our origin is through archaeology. The problem with relying on solely archaeology is that our ability to dig into our past is very limited. There's one example that I love that really painted a vivid picture for me, that the Titanic currently is about 90% decayed after 100 years. And that's under the ocean, so obviously there's a lot more deterioration that happens there. But any evidence for advanced cultures, it's hard to determine their level of advancement because their artifacts are, they deteriorate very quickly. And so without having tapping into direct memory of these ancient cultures, as people can do through meditation, and relying on science, which is a sound practice but can often be very limited, it distorts our perspective of history to the point where oftentimes we don't know where we come from, and that very radically changes our understanding of who we are and what we're doing here. Max, do you want to add?
Yeah, no, Jack, everything you're saying I love, and especially the Titanic analogy I think is so perfect. Another one is you sit in a Model T today or any car that built in the 1950s, 1940s, and it's decaying before your eyes. You can smell the rust. You can really, you're sitting in the middle of this rapidly decaying machine. And, what would be left after thousands of years is a great question. But I think, bringing things back to the present, we look at where archaeology is today, I think, there's a lot of hesitation to get involved based around, oftentimes these discoveries won't make its way down to the mainstream for maybe 10, 20, or 30 years, debated very heavily. Oftentimes these discoveries will, be shattering what is somebody else's entire career and body of work. We'll get into some of this in a little bit. But even as a child, I was telling Jack about this the other day. I got into this topic of archaeology and, re-examining our history. After, the last 20 years or so, I've just been so interested in exploration or so. And, everyone I was brought up around just kept telling me over and over again that everything has been discovered. If you really want to get involved in exploration, you either need to be looking to the stars or into the ocean, getting a degree in physics or biology, etc. And, you know, anything that has to do with ancient cultures. I personally was obsessed with the Egyptians at 4 years old, and that never really died, except for, you know, people would tell me, you know, Max, you know, Egyptologists don't even get to go to Egypt. You know, you're going to spend your entire life, you know, working at some high school or middle school, which, you know, there's no problem with that. But I think, you know, oftentimes there's this very, you know, fatalist portrait of what we've already discovered, and, you know, that there really isn't anything else left. And this is simply not the case. And just in more recent years, more technology has come to the surface, you know, bringing about serious improvements in surveying different, you know, jungle sites from above, or, you know, looking at seismic data from deep underground. And what we're able to do today is, you know, we can cover surveying certain, you know, canopies in the jungle, which would initially take maybe, you know, 4 or 5 months to do, sending people on the ground, or, you know, planes over above. You know, what we can do now in 4 or 5 months, we can do in 40 minutes with LiDAR when we, you know, send planes over above, and we do, you know, this photo scanning that basically can paint a picture of what's beneath the canopy. And just in the last 10 years alone, you know, tens and tens of pyramids have been discovered in Mexico, South America, the Amazon as well. And a lot of this stuff is really repainting our picture. So to say that, you know, everything's been discovered, I think is the biggest, you know, the biggest piece of crap that I've ever heard. And, you know, we are actually living at what might be the golden age of archaeology right now. And we're going to get into a few more of these recent findings that really paints this, you know, more complicated picture. You know, as children, we're taught that science started with the Greeks or started with Rome, you know, agriculture, the use of aqueducts, etc. But when we look further and further back, we're finding that earlier cultures had this knowledge, and that there might have been some sort of a renaissance. Jack?
Yeah, so speaking about Greek and Rome Renaissance, I think most of our current perception of history sort of emerges from this paradigm. And there's one character that comes up often when you start doing research about Egypt, which is Thoth. And this is a character who brought hieroglyphs to Egypt. And this character is transferred over to Greece and Rome as Hermes Trismegistus. And the reason I bring that up is because Egyptians were dealing in high-level mathematics and other advanced avenues of science and math that the Greeks ended up basically, you know, hijacking and using for their own purposes. We often think that Pythagoras, you know, invented geometry, and sure, from a Western perspective, that may be the case, but a lot of these people pay tribute to Egypt as the foundation of their own learnings and teachings.
Yeah, and it's sadly though, you know, today, you know, what we're being taught in school is quite the opposite. You know, oftentimes when we look at ancient Egypt, we see the builders of these pyramids, but, you know, people have this mental image of it just being, you know, these slaves, and, you know, even the rulers are wearing essentially loincloths. And, you know, this was a serious culture that we now, you know, scientists looking back, they, you know, they can see that they might have even had an understanding of advanced pharmacology, antibiotics, natural antibiotics, and things like that. And even right now, we're looking into their practice of neurosurgery. One of my father's partners at New York University is studying this, which is very exciting too. But, you know, as soon as we begin studying the Greeks and studying ancient Rome, you know, we go back and, you know, we see that a lot of what they're talking about comes from, you know, potentially the same place. And on the next slide, Jack, yeah. So, you know, we look at the Library of Alexandria, which is said where most of the records of ancient Egypt have been held. You know, it went up in flames, you know, thousands of years ago, and everything has been lost, and all we have really to go off of are hieroglyphs that would be on the walls of these temples. And you know, there's the temple of I believe, well, Temple of Horus at Edfu. They say that this is where the majority of the pyramid texts come from, or what's just written on the walls. but every document that was stored in this place went to the Library of Alexandria and has been destroyed. And, you know, we've lost during this time so much of the sacred sciences, which Jack, I'm sure, will talk about a little bit more, but, you know, certain things with mathematics, the understanding of pi, etc., you know, it comes from this earlier chapter. And, you know, it's quite a question, you know, as to where it all went. You know, what were the ancient Greek and ancient Roman philosophers and scientists looking at and examining, right? What were they studying? And has there been any, you know, potential cover-up or, you know, any attempt to get rid of these documents that were showing, you know, a potentially different origin of science?
One of the things that I want to bring up here is if you look at the image on the right side, you'll see the Eye of Horus next to a cross-section of the brain. And it basically shows that the Egyptians had such a developed knowledge of the anatomy of the body. And that's just one example. There are many examples of how their symbolism was an analogy or a metaphor for the body itself. And if you can imagine, imagine a culture that grounds all of its storytelling and all of its symbolism in a deepening relationship with the body, with our relationship to the planets, as we'll see, and to the relationship with the stars, as we'll see. This is a culture. You know, we tell stories today about bank robbers and you know, casino heists, and these people are telling stories about their own biology as a way to deepen their relationship with the natural world. And to call them primitive is just a reduction of their empire, you know, for purposes unknown. But you know, to see this and to recognize that these people were using these narrative tools as a way to deepen their relationship, I think, and just in my own life, I can speak to how it's just garnered such a huge respect for these cultures. And this is just a great quote from Graham Hancock, that we're a species with amnesia.
Graham Hancock, I just want to add, is, you know, one of the top spokesperson on this subject in general of re-examining our past, and he's, you know, traveling to archaeological sites all around the globe, investigating these further, interviewing all the scientists working on it, bringing in geologists, oceanographic, you know, scientists, etc. And he's written about 7 or 8 books on this topic. And more recently, a lot of what he was theorizing about these conclusions about re-examining human migration and things like that have always been looked at as with some degree of ridicule, which is often the case of anything within the archaeological community until it is set in stone, right? Because all of these points are so sensitive to the scientists and the archaeologists who are focusing on them within their careers, whether it's somebody's arguing about whether one tool came from X site versus 100 miles away, you know, and they might spend their entire, you know, 2 decades of their career focusing on this one minute subject, which to them is not minute. But I think that this slow churning process of bringing, you know, these findings down to the surface level, whether it's re-examining human migration or finding evidence of humans in the Americas at an earlier date, is often met with a lot of disdain. And on the next slide, something that we're going to talk about is essentially reestablishing our timeline. So starting, we want to, basically what we're taught in school is that history begins roughly about 10,000 years BC, following the end of the last ice age. And this is when we have Homo sapiens crossing the Bering Strait land bridge, connecting northern Siberia and Alaska. And that some people came over before it froze over, and then more people joined as there was a period of thaw that existed for a brief period of time. And these people who came across at that time, we know them as the Clovis people. And until about 500 years ago, with the arrival of the Spanish in the Americas, we're currently still being taught that in the Americas, we had no other contact. except for that brief period of time when people crossed over the land bridge. And on the next slide, Jack, we have an image of what we're currently looking at. So we're looking at people coming over during this melting, this brief thaw that happened, where the Bering Strait was crossable. And we have megafauna, all these mastodons and mammoths crossing over with their hunter cultures, the Clovis. And we see them making their way down through North America and eventually South America. Something interesting, though, is that not a single piece of evidence exists below Panama indicating that the Clovis culture ever went any further south. So already this is being challenged to some degree. And when we're looking at DNA as well as ancient artifacts, we're seeing that there might have been multiple periods of migration happening, not just 10,000 years ago, but potentially, far before that, up to 100,000 BC, or, even a little bit further, as we'll show you. So basically, moving on, we're challenging this timeline. So we're challenging what, we previously knew about humans coming over 10,000 BC during the Stone Age. There's famous movies like 10,000 BC by Roland Emmerich, who actually auctioned the rights of a lot of Graham Hancock's books, but little of what Graham talks about ends up in any of his movies, whether it's 2012 or Independence Day, blah, 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 But when we're looking at the timeline, so basically this whole idea of the Clovis people coming first has been totally thrown away. And this started with not just sites in North America that are dating back to an earlier date, but initially it really came up with these South American archaeologists studying the site of Monteverde. And what this site proved was that there was a layer showing human activity 12,850 BC. And then more recently, just in the last few years, we discovered another layer that goes a little bit further deep, and it shows human activity from 31,000 BCE. The 31,000 date has not been fully accepted, but the 12,850 date is confirmed, going back, a few thousand years before we had humans even coming into North America, but we're showing them at an earlier time in South America. As I mentioned, there's some earlier sites in California, or in North America, one being the California site, which was discovered in the late 1990s by Tom Demeray and his team of geologists. And basically this was published in Nature, which is one of the most reputable science journals on the planet, which really stirred up everything in the scene. And basically what this is showing was that there could have been evidence of humans manipulating bones, creating tools, doing sophisticated hunting methods, 130,000 years ago. And this is about 120,000 years prior to the date that we had confirmed humans coming into the Americas. And this still remains to be one of the most debated topics in archaeology, and it's completely unknown to most people. But these two findings, starting with the Monteverde site showing people at the 12,800 date, was really the first. And then more and more keeps bubbling up to the surface, painting a more complex ancient picture. Next, Jack and I were discussing that if we want to go further, we really need to talk about examining this ancient migration. Like, how did people end up in South America? Were there people in South America before North America? When we're looking at mound sites in the Amazon or mound sites in Mississippi, we're seeing that these places were built in South America from roughly 2,000 years before anything was discovered in North America. So there might have been a culture that came into South America before we have anyone coming down from the north. And whether or not they come from the same lineage to any degree is, also debated. But we do find differences in the tools that are found at these sites, as well as differences in their DNA, which is something that is, everyone's talking about this right now, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Jack, do you have anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that there are a lot of similarities, as you can expand upon, between the Egyptian mythology and the mythologies of the people that lived in what is now Mississippi area. There's giant sites in Mississippi, and if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so, well, even before we go there, I think it's also important to look at, in South America, similarities between the Egyptians and people of the Andes, like the pre-Inca. We have at this lake which is the highest lake on the planet, Lake Titicaca and Tiwanaku in the Andes. And there's this temple that's attributed to Viracocha, who's their creator god. And what's interesting is the mythology that those people still tell to this day tells an identical story to that of the Egyptian god Osiris, even to the specifics of how they died, who betrayed them, and their current marital situation, which is really fascinating. And so we do see some similarities to that degree. But what you're mentioning in Mississippi, we have two cultures, the Egyptians and that of the Mississippi River Valley people, both who came up on a river. They're looking at the stars, and anthropologists often credit this alone to be why that there's similarities in their culture. But the mythologies that we're now examining a lot with much more scrutiny than we ever have before are showing similarities that go back as far as even connecting the deities that they meet in the afterlife and the same order of deities that they meet as they go into the afterlife. So it's not just similar archetypal images, but to the same systematic order of who you're meeting when you go off. And is this question about, did the Egyptians come in to the Americas at a certain date during their the height of their civilization? That's possible. Or did all of these cultures stem from an earlier ancestor, which we'll talk about a little bit earlier, which the ancestors of the Clovis and the ancestors of the people who came in through South America at an earlier date. But when we do examine Mississippi and we look at that of Egypt, we see similarities that are just so close that it's hard to dismiss anything like that. And then at Lake Titicaca, we have Osiris and Viracocha's similarities in their mythology. It's so specific. Is there something more complicated going on here? And we're going to show you some images as well that are showing. So on this page, before we talk about Lake Titicaca, this is from Alta, northern Norway, and this is showing evidence of cave painting showing earlier mariners. So, even to this day, they say that the Egyptians were not technologically evolved enough to have crossed the ocean, 2500 BC, even at that earlier date when we say that the pyramids were likely built, or that's what we're taught. But when we look at these cave paintings from northern Norway, or we're looking at cave paintings in France from similar ancestors of the people who built these, called the Solutreans. And these paintings, though, are from the ancestors of the Solutrean people. And this was done roughly around 10,000 to 8,000 BC. And these cave paintings, though, show boats. Oftentimes, they'll be showing animals that are not found right on the coastline, but would have required travel to local islands to do their fishing and that sort of thing as well. So whether these were boats made of skin and, very primitive sailing methods, but they were utilizing boats as far as we can tell from their cave paintings, which is, also extremely controversial. And then on the next slide, these are some images from France, this is from Spain's Cantabrian region. So these two images here are featured in the recent bestseller Denisovan Origins by Andrew Collins and Gregory L. Little. And what they're discussing are that the ancestors of the birthplace, the people who were at the birthplace of civilization, which we now are really attributing to these people in the southwestern or southeastern Anatolia region in Turkey. What we're looking at are the ancestors of those people. And this is before the end of the last ice age. These are cave paintings from 16,000 BCE showing skiffs. You can see a group of people on a boat that's kind of similar to the one in the northern Norway image. And then on the right-hand side, you can also see these images of what we believe might be sails caught up in the wind. So yeah, it's just, things just keep getting more and more complicated. And on the next slide, distant ancestors' ancient ships. So we're going to go back to Lake Titicaca in the Andes and connecting the Egyptians there. We're finding more and more ancient ships in Egypt along where the Nile has moved many miles, like many kilometers over over the last few thousand years. And when we look at where the Nile River existed at these earlier dates, we're finding many boats with sails, these reed boats, which as they hit the water, they expand and are extremely stable and well constructed. But when we look even today at Lake Titicaca, these reed boats of almost an identical design are still being used by the local people. This is also connecting the idea that the Egyptians might have visited the Americas and potentially taught, some more of their nautical and agricultural, as well as their spiritual practices. And we're going to get into a little bit later why the Egyptians might have come back. And so on this next slide, what Jack and I were discussing this the other day, and we were talking about the practice of yoga and yoga going so much further back. And I brought this to his attention is that on the images on the right, if you look at the bottom left, you're going to see this Peshwarti seal, which comes from Mohenjo-daro, which is in the Aryan region near Pakistan, above India. And this city is from 3000 BC, much before civilization really took off in India to what we know. And it's showing an advanced yoga pose, yoga already being potentially in, a very long-standing science before India was really developed, and there was a debate that existed for a long time about the Indo-Aryan invasion, saying that these people came from the north and really rebuilt India or built India. And, this has now been confirmed just in the last few years. Wars have been waged over this topic, but the true ancestors of India's culture and saying that it came from this place was a very controversial topic. But back to this slide, we have some images from what we believe is the first culture to ever exist in the Americas, the Olmec culture, and they exist, we find them in Mexico, in central region of Mexico. And, these massive stone heads are discovered all over these sites. I think that there's currently 13 of these heads that have been discovered. There's many of them at the Museum of the Anthropology Museum in Mexico City. You can see many of them there. And but when we look at the artifacts that are discovered at this Olmec site, I mean, this is a culture that we know nothing about besides some of these artifacts that we've found in these massive stone heads that we can't explain how they were constructed, where they came from, who these people were, etc. But when we look at their artifacts, as you can see on the next page as well, we see more connections to that of yoga being an earlier practice. So this is kind of mind-blowing, but we're seeing all of these different positions being depicted in their in these finds that have shown up at the Olmec sites, showing that yoga might be a much more ancient science than we were led to believe. And this is also something that is extremely controversial, especially when we talk about the progression of culture in India and yoga being such a big important part of India's culture. Jack, do you have anything to say here?
No, that's it. But I'm psyched. You guys got a little sneak peek.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking now about evidence for potentially why we had a massive cultural reset and we emerged out of a sort of cataclysmic age that eradicated our culture. So this would provide evidence as to why these cultures had very many similarities and potentially them all stemming from a global culture or a much more advanced culture before that. So first thing to bring up here is a really, really interesting discovery made by Dr. Robert Schoch of Boston University. So when he was called out to Egypt, he was asked by a friend, John Anthony West, to come out to date this seeming weather erosion on the side of the Sphinx, which you can see on the small graphic on the side. And he dated the weather erosion that happened. He gave a conservative estimate that it only could have been caused by massive amounts of rain. And the only time that that could have happened, and this was corroborated by another friend of his, Randall Carlson, based on activity in the silt of the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, that this could have only happened on a conservative estimate 15,000 years ago. And so that would have meant that this structure existed 15,000 years ago, and potentially even more, because that's when the weather erosion happened for this monument. So, you know, that must have meant that they weren't, you know, concerned in taking care of this monument any longer, or something had happened to the civilization. So, very interesting discovery that opens up a big can of worms.
And so, something also to add is that, you know, a lot of people argue about the dating of the Sphinx based on the idea that no one could have constructed anything like this at an earlier date than 2500 BC. And, you know, more and more things are showing that, you know, there definitely were cultures that could construct something at this degree, and we'll get into that in a moment. But when we're looking around the sides of the Sphinx and you see the water erosion, as Jack mentioned, that Dr. Schoch was evaluating and confirmed, he even said that the Egyptologists, they can say whatever they want about this site, but as you know, as a geologist, there is no other explanation than this being water erosion. And you know, his findings have been scoffed at for many years, and more recently have continued to be confirmed by other people of his community. Boston University also just gave him his own school to research these types of things, where now you can get a degree from the school of, I believe it's the researching ancient civilizations. So, you know, it's very interesting, but a lot of naysayers about this water erosion hypothesis will say, you know, couldn't wind have done this? But, you know, the Sphinx, though, completely, the basin that it's contained in completely fills up with sand when it's, you know, left alone for 40 years, 30 years. The last time I mean, even during when Napoleon was in Egypt, we have images of this Sphinx depicted by artists where it's completely covered up to the neck. There's no body dug out. It was completely preserved. And, you know, whether this was uncovered again 2500 BC by the Egyptians, and maybe there was a great construction project that happened on the Giza Plateau at that date, but more and more is pointing that the date goes further and further back. And on the next slide, something that Jack and I have been discussing at quite a lot of length is the dates for this weathering. And so in these images that you'll see here are, if you turn the clocks of the ancient sky back to about 10,000 BC and a little bit before, the two constellations are mirrored here. And what you have is the Sphinx facing due east to the constellation Leo, the Great Lion. And then we also have a perfect alignment of the Great Pyramids of Giza matching with Orion's belt. But it's only if you wind back the skies to this earlier date does it fit this mark. And another thing is that the Great Pyramid, where it sits on the Giza Plateau, is also at where it's facing directionally. I believe it's facing north, but it's off by such a slight degree of facing true north, which, as we can see, the Egyptians had such a level of science, and something that is not not being disputed by the Egyptologists is that they had an understanding of direction to such a degree, as we see it surface in many other sites like Karnak and other temples that have precise precision with the equinoxes and the rise of the sun and different celestial alignments. But something just to note is that the constellation of Orion matching that of Giza needed to be at this date, and the variant degree that we see in a shift between the Great Pyramid facing true north is off by a degree that would have only shifted by that 10,000 approximate change in year. So that's another thing that's interesting. And lastly, I wanted to add about the Sphinx is that the head of the Sphinx is so much smaller than that of the body. And many people believe that it was recarved into this more human image after much, weathering or whatever it might have been, water erosion over these years, and that it was recarved to mimic that of the pharaoh Khafre, who we currently attribute the building of the Great Pyramid to as being his tomb. So it's interesting because the Sphinx, might have been carved as a lion. It might have been facing Leo on this date. That also fully coincides with the alignment of Orion's belt. But it's, a lot. The dates just align a little bit too perfectly to not give this any consideration, especially when we're talking about a culture that was essentially looking at themselves as heaven's mirror, right? As above, so below, building, their monuments with such celestial precision. It makes no sense that they would not be paying attention or making mistakes. So next we wanted to chat about the discovery of Göbekli Tepe. So this is precisely, a site that completely throws the argument that no one could have constructed anything like the Sphinx to the curb. And this was discovered in 1996 and is still being excavated. And it was discovered by this archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who died a few years ago, sadly. But he was excavating this massive complex in the southeastern Anatolia region of Turkey, known as Göbekli Tepe. And Göbekli Tepe dates back 12,000 years ago. This site has more than 200 pillars, weighing, more than 20 feet high, weighing up to 10 tons, making these circle formations. And on each of these pillars, we see evidence of three-dimensional carving, which means that these images of these animals, as you can see on this pillar, everything was carved around them to bring them out, which is also, showing a serious level of artistry at this, ancient date. People constantly are, analyzing Stonehenge and looking for the builders of Stonehenge, etc. But this site is 7,000 years older than Stonehenge, with incredible art, celestial alignment to, we can get into that a little bit later or at another date, but the alignments there also go back to perfect. So basically, this image is from Pillar 43 in Enclosure D at Göbekli Tepe. And if you align the sphere that's on the left wing of the vulture, which is a bird that shows up in the mythology of all of the ancestors of the builders of Göbekli Tepe, as well as North American ancestors of potentially the same source, but it fits perfectly in the sky with that of the Cygnus constellation. And something really fascinating is that this alignment was not precise to where it's located in the complex of Göbekli Tepe. It would have been precise if it was constructed about 2,000 years prior to when it was built. So this is potentially, the builders of Göbekli Tepe are for some reason commemorating, a certain date in their history that's 2,000 years before this was constructed. So what happened 2,000 years before, and that's the big mystery, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. But before we get there, we should look at the ancestors of the builders of Göbekli Tepe. And these are the Solutrean people. So basically about 20,000 BC to 13,000 BC, we have the Solutrean people. On the background image here, you can see the cave in Lascaux, France, full of incredible cave art, showing three-dimensional depictions of animals, serious high level of art. There's a beautiful documentary about it called The Cave of Forgotten Dreams. But these people were at an advanced skill of artistry, but also technology. And these Solutreans, they had like flint mines. As you can see above, we have these Solutrean points, which were spear points and also blade points, that were using this flint pressure method, basically using multiple tools to create these blades that show up like identically throughout Siberia. And we see very similar blades also come from the Clovis, who were the people of North America that came over the Bering Strait. So it's just very interesting. And, we don't know much about the Solutreans, and we don't know much about where they came from, except more recently, as we look at the story of DNA, we're able to paint a little bit of a bigger picture. And it's likely that these Solutrean people they descended from the Denisovans, who we'll talk about a little bit later. But these Denisovans, they were of a much higher, much taller species of human, and that they very likely bred with Neanderthals and also modern humans that were emerging at this time, creating these subspecies that might have also been a little bit more advanced, keeping in their own groups. But lastly, I wanted to just mention about the Solutreans. As you can see on the far right, this is a depiction of this one rock that's in France called La Roche des Solutres. And this rock, they found hundreds of skeletons of horses, whether this was some sort of a sacrifice. There's the mythology of the wind horse that shows up in many cultures much later. But basically, what we know is that around La Roche des Solutres was horse farms. So they were breeding horses for certain purpose, but they were also sacrificing them for some purpose. And buried with some of these Solutrean shaman, as well as people who were deemed in, precious stones and metals, buried in elaborate graves, they might have been a king or a holy person, but they're often buried with horses that also, show evidence of being domesticated. And domestication of horses doesn't happen until a few thousand years ago, but we look back to this culture that existed 20 to 15,000 BC, and we see that they were not just, building these caves with masterpiece, artistic designs on the walls, but we also see, a culture that was domesticating horses and potentially riding horses at an earlier date. And when we look at the story of their DNA, we see that it trickles into Mongolia, where we have such a close relationship with these horses, as well as in South America, we have Denisovan DNA popping up, which is painting a more complicated image. I know this is quite a lot to get into, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a taste of what we're looking at when we go further back before the end of the last ice age. Yeah, so Jack, do you want to start this off?
Sure, yeah. So there is a major theory that's being worked out with many different universities at the moment. This is a presentation of the potential cause of a massive extinction event that happened 12,800 years ago. And we're going to present a lot of information to back this up. But basically, a massive comet or impact happened on the northern hemisphere that caused a massive extinction event that caused the entire northern hemisphere to basically light on fire. And there's a lot of evidence for, mass extinctions of mammoths, for example, with their legs just blown clean out and they die. And so this is just one small piece, but it points to like I said, a massive impact that would have caused such devastation that it would have wiped out any civilization. If you could imagine, we'll go into the effects of this, but if you can imagine this level of impact, today, many of our cultures are built on sea level. So just the sea level rise alone from the North American and Greenland ice sheets melting would cause devastation. So we're going to go into that.
Well, adding on to that, I just wanted to mention that, this comet impact, the date of when this impact would have happened, which would have brought about, this massive, almost apocalyptic climate that existed for about 2,000 years. Um, we see the date show up precisely on that image I was talking about earlier about Göbekli Tepe, is that the date that is being depicted on Pillar 43 would have been one day approximately 12,800 years ago, which is interesting that these people, these builders of Göbekli Tepe, might have been a society of the survivors of this mass extinction event that happened at the end of the last ice age. And even this comet impact was something that was hotly debated for a long time. And, people like Graham Hancock, we were talking about earlier, made this kind of the thesis of their argument. But up until the last 10 years or so, this hasn't been able to be confirmed. And, now we're finding evidence of this everywhere, and that it's almost, it's not disputed by the geological community. The archaeological community is looking at it still seriously and taking it into consideration. These findings are being published in journals like Nature, and but we also have, more evidence showing this impact just based on things we're looking at today, doing digs in the Amazon or in North America. And on the next slide, we have some images of that. And this image on the top right is of the black mat, which is often called, and basically this is showing charred earth at a level that goes back exactly 12,800 years ago. And evidence of the Younger Dryas impact is showing at sites all around this lower image that you can see there on the map. And just to paint a little bit of a bigger picture of this is that, roughly about 12,800 years ago, this comet descended upon the planet and engulfed, as Jack mentioned, much of the northern hemisphere on fire, but this is 1/10 of the entire planet's biomass that we can safely say, was on fire on this, during this period of time. And some of the largest fragments of this comet collided with the largest two ice sheets of North America, sending more ice into the air as well as toxic vapor, creating acid rain. And, this is one of the most serious and horrific period of human history. And we're only just starting to get to the topic. So it's
Yeah.
really fascinating.
One other thing that I think this starts to paint a picture of is civilization as we currently have a picture of it as re-emerging from this period of acid rain, intense radiation, and flooding and massive fires. So, for a civilization to survive that, it would have had to go back into, a stone age essentially, and then
Exactly.
from the ground up.
No, and also in addition to that, this reset that would have had to have happened, most our cities today would not be able to survive this type of an impact, let alone the infrastructure crashing. We're seeing this with coronavirus today. We're barely able to get on by. And, when you're looking at the cultures that were present before this impact, which, we have thousands of years of data showing the Solutreans at a more advanced stage in their artistry, as well as their technology and, potential early trade systems. We're finding those flints that I was talking about on the previous page, dispersed many thousands of miles all over Europe, coming from potentially the same mine, which geologists are now examining, which shows that these Solutreans might have had even sophisticated mining practices where they were sending their toolkit across Europe. What though happened from that date of like 15,000 BC and 12,800 years ago, 10,800 BC? How much development could have happened if this culture had already developed beautiful paintings and sophisticated technology for mining methods, as well as transportation, had domesticated horses? How far could they have gotten in that period of time? And I think that this is the lost civilization that we should be looking for, is the descendants of these Solutrean people. And, also the survivors of the Younger Dryas impact are also who we should be looking at. And, you know, these are the people who built Göbekli Tepe, right? The descendants of the Solutreans. These are people who survived, you know, a massive earth-shattering cataclysm, right? You know, and on this next slide, yeah, Jack and I pulled this offline, but this shows the basic, you know, temperature graph of the planet starting 15,000 BC on, and it shows this sudden dip after we have a gradual warming off at the end of the last ice age, and then we see a deep freeze all of a sudden happen, and then a rapid period of warming again. And during this period of, you know, unstable climate with acid rain, fire, etc., you know, who would have survived this? The oceans were rising, ice caps were melting, you know, floods were creating new valleys. We have, you know, we can even, geologists are able to say today, a lot of, you know, valleys in North America were formed during this time or shifted during this time. It's, you know, quite apocalyptic. And, you know, yeah. So, and the next thing we wanted to chat about is, you know, the massive amount of water shift, you know, you have. And so during the Younger Dryas period, you have all this water coming off of the melted ice caps. You have, especially when things started heating up after the deep freeze again, you have spouts of water shooting out from under the ice caps, creating valleys and, you know, destroying entire forest regions as well. And basically, you know, there's the mythology of Kumari Kandam, which, Jack, you can mention a little bit about Atlantis and all of this.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to talk briefly about this because one of the things that I want to bring up here is that the Earth is pressurized on the crust. So one side, you know, is holding a certain amount of pressure to keep the other side pressured as well. And so when there's a massive release of pressure on the northern side because of the melting of these ice sheets, that's going to cause an equal reaction on the other side because it's all connected. So in this case, you know, this is a mythological land, but it very really could be the event that happened would have caused these massive shifts in the landmass, and you know, the flooding alone, as you know, if it was only, as we'll see on the next slide, 90 feet of sea rise. I'll just go to that slide. So you'll see here that the brown area is land that was exposed and would have been submerged by this melting. And so this equates to, you know, a small continent of landmass that was lost. And when you take into account that upwards of 90% of our civilizations are built on the coast, you know, this would have been devastating to any civilization that existed at this time.
I think it's important to also note on that previous slide, just when you look at Southeastern Asia, or next slide, Jack, sorry. But looking at Southeastern Asia, just below, you know, you have Japan, the Sea of Japan is completely flooded. You have surrounding India flooded. We have South America, these coastlines also flooded. You know, what could have been lost beneath the waves is something that, you know, oftentimes people are questioning. And, you know, the topic of Atlantis as well, you know, often refers to a civilization that plummeted underwater. And, you know, I think a lot of times people have in their mind these ideas of advanced technology, these ancient cities, etc. But I think what we really need to look at is just archaeological evidence of people existing on these submerged coasts. And, you know, only a few of these regions have properly been examined, Japan being one of them. But India, for example, which we'll talk about later, has virtually no diving culture at all. And, you know, there's about 70 different sites actually depicted in this Graham Hancock book, Underworld, where he spent many years surveying India as well as the Maldives and various other places in the world, trying to, you know, organize dives, you know, some of them related with the government and, you know, major groups. But basically, you know, there's so much that we don't know and so much that could have been wiped away beneath the ocean. And I think, you know, the more that we go and look at these plausible locations, especially when we follow certain mythologies, the more we're finding, as we'll see later. But anyway. Yeah, so from the last ice age, so when we're looking back at the technology and we're looking back at these artifacts from 12,000, 130,000 years ago, you know, there's no way to dismiss that there were these primitive people living amongst a more advanced people. You know, we see serious depictions of art coming from Siberia and France. You know, we'll get into some more discoveries that have happened in that region later showing serious advancements. But we also have, you know, people living in the jungles. We had people living in the jungles of India up until the Indo-Aryan invasion, etc. Or even, you know, in South America, we have these indigenous people living in the jungle. And when we think about the difference between where we're at today and where these people were at, you know, 12,800 BC, you know, there could very well have been a more advanced people living amongst uncontacted tribes in the jungles. And when we discuss cataclysm in the Younger Dryas period, anthropologists look at what types of cultures could have survived this type of impact and this type of destruction. And, you know, they say that the people who were in the jungle, like these people living in the jungles, these people who are more in touch with their soul and more in touch with their community, you know, something that us living in our modern cities, we are completely, you know, completely distanced from. So, you know, I think that by examining who survived these impacts, I think is also a good suggestion at us in our modern day of life, you know, maybe re-examining things that we should do and start rethinking about so that, you know, we might be able to survive if something like this ever happens again. Yeah. On this slide, this is a great image showing just the rapid seawater, you know, rise we have around the coast of India. And as Jack was mentioning earlier, you know, it's common for these civilized people to put their biggest resources on coastlines. We have that even today. But when we're looking at these pre-deluge coastlines, we might find this evidence from an earlier date. You know, anything would have been completely destroyed after this impact and after the water level rise. I mean, these are, you know, super tsunamis and, you know, typhoons, not just tropical storms.
Sea level rise in this part of the Pacific. Huge tracts of land were inundated in the region at the end of the Ice Age, as striking new research now shows.
The orange areas show the part of the land that was exposed about 20,000 years ago.
Dr. Glenn Milne of Durham University in the north of England is a world expert on sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age.
If you take a look at Japan up here, the North Island was connected to the mainland. All that area was flooded within about 10,000 years.
Where you see the dramatic changes are up here. We're looking at a completely filled in sea.
So yeah, you just could imagine this amount of flooding happening in a relatively quick amount of time. Had there been this impact, you know, it would have been devastating.
Looking at the evidence of, you know, civilization beneath the waves, you know, we have these massive super tsunamis would have taken anything out. However, we can find, you know, these stone circles and stone roads and other megalithic monuments beneath the waves, and you know, showing that there might have been, you know, something existing at this earlier date. And I want to mention that these two images on the left are from Bimini in the Bahamas, you know, popular diving location. But it's fascinating, these strips of these megalith rocks, you know, lining these roads that go on for quite some time. But when we look at the earliest maps, specifically the Piri-Reis map, which, you know, was made by a Turkish admiral in, you know, I think the 1500s, but he was basing his map off of copies of other maps that go back to maps that were copied from the Library of Alexandria. And on his map, which was considered fiction at the time, even though he's, you know, was a serious cartographer, and his maps actually led to that of, you know, other explorers. Columbus, I believe, was also looking at similar maps that the Piri-Reis was looking at as well. But just something interesting is that this road that we find in Bimini in the Bahamas shows up exactly at its location on one of these maps. So that's another fascinating thing. So, who knows what type of map making was done on an earlier date, but the evidence just continues to keep on going. And on this next slide, we have written about the Yonaguni Monument of the southern coast of Okinawa, Japan. And this is from, last above water 10,000 years ago, precisely at the end of the last ice age. And, it's still depicted all around the globe if this was man-made or a natural monument. And if it is man-made, Yonaguni would be one of the oldest structures on the planet, next to Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. And, this is potentially coming from a culture that had no contact with the builders of Göbekli Tepe, except when we look at DNA. And when we look at the DNA that shows up in South America, that from these people that were before the North American descendants, we're able to paint this deeper image that there might have been Denisovans, or there were Denisovans from their DNA in the Southern Asian area. And, maybe this was a group that split off from the advancement that we see in France and Siberia, et cetera, and that these people might have migrated further south at an earlier date. And, their advancements, we have no idea what they could have gotten up to in thousands of years. I mean, we look to the north and we find, potential like horse domestication and beautiful cave paintings and technological tools, but, and as you'll see later, jewelry. But when we're looking at these places in the south, we're actually finding even more convincing structures. And on the next slide, we'll have a clip.
We stick pretty much to plan, descending at once to what looks like a flat pathway running along the base of the main structure at a depth of about 85 feet. From there, I lead the way up the sheer south face of the structure. 50 feet beneath the waves, we come to a stone platform that directly overlooks the pathway. Wolf investigates a set of huge geometrical steps which tower above us. It looks as if immense quantities of rock must have been removed from the entire platform in order to expose these steps. We swim past another series of further terraces to the upper platform of the structure in just 15 feet of water. We make it eventually to the structure that I call the pool, a basin in the surface of the rock which is curved and weathered on one side, clean-edged and angular on the other. I think these three holes were originally man-made and much shallower, then later widened and deepened by natural potholing processes. Eastwards again, we drop down into deeper water where the turtle lies spread out on its own platform.
Yeah, you can see from that, I mean, to me, it's very obviously man-made. It's still being debated, but, it just looks like a temple to me.
Yeah, and as, this was discovered in 1986. And, various top marine biologists and geologists have examined the formations as well as, the existing biology that's living on the mass. And, everyone says that this site has, definitely been man-made. It's still just being debated by, various journals and also the global archaeological community, because it paints this, much more complicated image of our past. And on this next page, I wanted to just briefly mention these sites of evidence of sunken cities in India. One of them being, which is the background image here, Mahabalipuram, which is famous for its 7 pagodas, and how these pagodas have been built on this, or rebuilt on the coast. And potentially it was a mirror of a much older city. And that's what even their local legend says, is that it's kind of like New York or a York, you know. So Mahabalipuram was the reconstruction of an older site. And even in journals from English, you know, colonists and also local fishermen and their stories as well, is, you know, even 50 to 100 years ago, or in the 1800s, there was these small pagodas also coming out of the waves, which is, you know, pretty interesting as well. And local divers still talk about fishing among the ruins, even though it hasn't been confirmed by archaeologists. And the other site is Dwarka, which also has the same concept, that it was a city that is rebuilt. It's a rebuilt city based on one that was destroyed during a massive flood. And Graham Hancock, who we just saw exploring Yonaguni with geologists, he ended up organizing a dive to Dwarka, and off of the coast, they ended up finding these stone structures exactly where it would have been prior to submergence. So, you know, that's also fairly fascinating. And then on this slide, the background image I want to mention really briefly is a design plan of Mohenjo-Daro, which we talked about earlier, that city from 3000 BC that possessed, you know, the image of the advanced yoga position on that plate. And, you know, Mohenjo-Daro was a city with sophisticated draining. There were city centers, urban planning, etc. And this was thousands of years before the aqueducts of Rome. This is, you know, this is showing serious evidence of understanding of just city planning, etc., at an earlier date. You know, this is before the confirmed dating of the construction of the Sphinx. You know, and when looking at ancient advanced technology, I think it's important to think that you know, what we're looking for might be extremely different from the technology that we define for today, you know, and how today our technology is all about propelling us further into the future, making things easier for us. You know, and we've invested ourselves in this route of building more and more hardware, and essentially losing the technology that might be within us and might be a part of our consciousness as well. So yeah, we wanted to quickly mention the Denisovan Cave. So this is some advanced technology from the Denisovans, who were the ancestors, or the Solutrean people, and the builders of Göbekli Tepe, etc., are the ancestors of the Denisovans. And the Denisovans are these people that we initially find them in Siberia, but we are now finding their DNA dispersed in South Asia and Australia, as well as South America. And what we can find from this cave in Siberia, the Denisovan Cave, which was, you know, not discovered until, you know, it's recently discovered 20 years ago. And more keeps, you know, bearing fruition with every dig we do. And every year, more and more excavation, more things are being pulled out of the Denisova Cave. We have, I think, hundreds of thousands of artifacts have been pulled from this cave, and it shows evidence of human activity starting roughly 30,000, 35,000 BC, all the way up until potentially 300,000 BC of human activity in this cave. And, you know, we find there's horse DNA found in the cave. We find bracelets dated back from 40,000 years ago, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. And there's an image here on the right depicting this bracelet, which was found. And we've also found that there was a small dongle that would have hung from below it. And basically not just saying that this is a culture that valued fashion, you know, material, glamour, etc. These people had an interest in something that was not formally just for survival, right? And on top of that, when you examine the bracelet found in Denisova Cave, you can see on the image that we have here as well, you can see these rings that are formed around the drilling point. And as we have on the left, we're talking about that this hole that was drilled into the bracelet, which is of a semi-precious stone that comes from a quarry many thousands of miles away from the cave, which is also, potentially interesting when it comes to these ancient trade routes. But when you're looking at the drilling, it's proven to be, the only way to do something like this means that it would have had to have come from a fixed high-speed drill, whether it's by hand, but it had to have been spinning at a serious speed to make the indentation that it has. And so the idea that there might have been, this slightly more advanced technological, but also very fashionable and kind of eccentric culture is also really fun. It's quite illuminating. And other artifacts that have been discovered there are like this bone needle, which you can see on the bottom, showing these very minuscule hole points as well. And it's quite interesting.
Thank you guys for going on this journey with us. I know it's quite a lot of information, but if you guys are looking for more of what we just shared, we'll have a playlist up on the website, which I'll send a link to in the follow-up email with this video, as well as the other 2 presentations that were made. And Quest for Light YouTube page is sort of a hub for many different playlists that expand on the topics that we've explored here. But yeah, Max, unless you have any closing thoughts, I want to open it up.
Yeah, no, I just think that, the more people that understand the importance of reevaluating our past and knowing where we come from, I think it's a conversation that I think gets lost by many people. Like, who cares where we came from? We're here and now. But I think that by looking further back, we're able to have a better understanding of who we are. And maybe it's also, tears down the barriers that we have between cultures as well, showing that, we might all be brethren to some degree, and all these things that we hold so dear about our origins and, where our culture is from often gets disturbed and, reshuffled. But if anyone has any questions or anything further, please reach out to me. I'm always happy to chat about the subject as well. And, we're currently developing a documentary project around this, and, I'd be happy to speak with anyone.
This is awesome. Thank you so much, guys. This is wild. Like, my brain is like, holy shit. Like, now I have so many Googling things to do now. Like, but this
I know it's honestly, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. I mean, even putting these slides together was really difficult for us because, we want to talk about the Americas maybe a little bit more and these mound sites, or we want to chat a little bit more about DNA and all these things, but it's really blowing the lid off of what we were taught. And the fact that this is so concrete, I mean, we're not saying anything that's or pointing out anything that's really esoteric or murky territory, but these are all serious confirmed finds, and this is what is being currently discussed in that community. So we're excited to talk about it, and happy for anyone to listen and spark some interest, because it's really ultimately up to our generation to be propelling this forward, especially as us as millennials, we're getting older, and we as the people, we're already less likely to trust our governments. To some degree, we're less likely to trust what we were taught in school. And I think this is coming out from the top people at, whether it's Oxford in archaeology, or we have, a bunch of people at Harvard are also examining this topic, let alone there being a new school at Boston University. But I think we're about to see a radical increase in people looking at and questioning and drawing conclusions between these findings.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be sure to build out a playlist for you, Alejandro, and for everybody else, if you're interested to dive deep into the different documentaries, the different YouTube explorations and podcasts that talk about this kind of stuff. Because I mean, when I started diving into this, I spent hours and hours and hours, as you can tell Max has as well, you know, just what are we discovering here? And really it is a new picture of humanity. And that is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Being re-examined, and you know, we are absolutely at the golden age of archaeology.
Yeah.
More is being uncovered in the last 15 years than has been uncovered in, you know, the last 500 years.
Yeah, plus I don't know if it's like also like a cultural thing difference or is the same, but I grew up mainly in Mexico City, so I do remember learning history very vaguely. Like yes, of course we cover the basic stuff, but like I feel like neither when I moved here and we cover history as well, like it's such a weird way that we teach these things that it's odd to me that we don't update it or optimize it as we are expanding our knowledge of the topic. And I don't know if it's because naturally people get so stuck on the ways of like how we have been teaching a certain way or like the content that especially if it comes from a public education, like if it's something the government has to say, then like are they willing to invest in putting the time to update all the books and like all this
Yeah.
stuff that we are. And it's a thing across cultures, like to your point, Max, of like how we will be in power at one point fully where we get to be not lazy or something, to truly say, okay guys, this is everything out there and nothing is biased and this is true. Like you know, like it's just weird, but it's super exciting to be like living life now, and we are able to see this come through for like our kids and things like that. That's
Oh
very
yeah. Well, even something that really came to my attention when I first started looking at this was, you know, this article that was published in Nature back in 2017 about this site that was discovered in Southern California from 130,000 years ago. And, you know, I was always under the belief that humans kind of have been only around in the Americas for 10,000 years. And I find that this, you know, this article came up, and this is not the first time that this concept of the Clovis people coming first has been, you know, questioned and dismissed. But looking into it a little bit more recently, I found that there's various different public school history books that there's like a bill that went around, or it was like a local public education bill in California that was going to implement some of these discoveries, and it was going to repaint the picture of human migration in the Americas, saying that this idea that the people only came down the Bering Strait and then eventually made their way to South America is wrong. And I think that by dismissing the fact that people were in South America at an earlier date, and dismissing these massive, you know, archaeological finds, and you know, whether it's in Bolivia, Argentina, etc., you know, we're almost taking away from the history of these people, you know. And I think that there's a question of racism that also exists in this field, where as when we repaint the picture of human migration, people get very offended, and rightly so, you know. But at the same time, I think the point of all of this is that it's way more complicated and way more fascinating than we ever imagined.
Mhm. No,
And
yeah.
I think, you know, it's going to be very exciting to see what happens. And I think more and more of what we're talking about right now is going to become more mainstream. And I think it really has to do with the mental state of, you know, where we're all at. You know, we're all questioning, we all want to know the truth. And there's a book that just came out the other year called Sapiens, which it's sold at every airport still. And Sapiens, you know, is painting this picture as well. You know, they're looking at the origins of, you know, human migration and talking about DNA, etc. But something like that book doesn't take the extra step to examine the implications of what it's talking about. You know, it's really just tiptoeing around it. There's even one paragraph in that book that talks about Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, but it mentions nothing about its significance. So, you know, its significance as far as painting this more ancient picture of our past, about how it, you know, firmly throws away the argument that the Sphinx could be older, etc. You know, and I think the more that we continue to see this stuff surfacing, it's just going to get more and more exciting.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that feels like a good place to close. Thanks everybody for joining. Just a little note from me to finish is that you know, coming from our last presentation about the expanded presence of Gaia and building our understanding of that, I feel like this helps us to show how cultures were using that knowledge to build a community around, as we saw with the pineal gland and the Eye of Horus. And so going onwards, I'm excited to expand, you know, into different avenues that they were exploring, these ancient cultures were exploring. One of the things that many of you might have come across is sacred geometry. And, you know, it's very obvious once you start looking at pyramids and things like that, that sacred geometry is very present in these structures. And, you know, these are things that me and Max like to talk about, but we realized that we didn't want to have a 90-page PowerPoint. So we're going to be expanding on this topic quite a bit, as well as using this as a foundation to dive into several other categories and topics about these different practices and whatnot. So thanks so much, guys, for coming. This has been a really amazing journey so far, and I'm grateful for all of you for taking part in it. And here's to the next one.
Yay. Thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate you guys putting all of this knowledge together. It's awesome.
Yeah, thank you. It's our pleasure, really.